Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 6 in my series on the Acts of the Apostles. Today we're looking at Acts chapter 9 and the conversion of St. Paul. Many years ago I can remember listening to a programme on BBC Radio in which various media figures were asked to, if it was possible, could they call up some figure from the past, have them brought to life so you could hear their voice again. And the writer Malcolm Muggeridge happened to be one of those on the programme, and he chose St. Paul. How wonderful it would be to hear the words of St. Paul again, preaching the gospel, he, the founder of Christianity. At this, some members in the radio audience started to giggle. Paul, the founder of Christianity, what was Muggeridge on about? The chairman interrupted. Wouldn't you rather hear the voice of Jesus? To which Muggeridge replied that he wouldn't presume to ask to hear the voice of Jesus. Now, strange as it may sound, many Jewish biblical scholars agree that Paul was the founder of Christianity. Jesus, they say, was an Orthodox Jew who never intended to found a new religion. It was Paul who changed the beliefs of the first Christians into something that could no longer be accommodated within the broad church of Judaism. Atheist conspiracy theorists even claim that Jesus never existed, that he was a mythical figure conjured up from Paul's religious experiences. But Jesus had a brother, James, whom Paul claimed to have met. And mythical figures don't normally have brothers that you can talk to. Jewish scholars can claim that Paul's religion was far removed from that of Jesus, and conspiracy theorists that Jesus didn't exist at all, because Paul placed so much emphasis on his personal religious experiences. Writing to the Galatian Christians, Paul says, I must make it clear to you, brothers and sisters, that the gospel you heard me preach is not of human origin. I did not take it over from anyone. No one taught it me. I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. He goes on to relate that after his conversion, he went off to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. By Arabia, he probably meant the Nabatean kingdom based around Petra, a major trading centre, and I'm sure you've seen those beautiful carvings of temples in the rose-coloured rock, and some of you may even have been to Jordan and seen this beautiful place. But anyway, Arab and Nabatean were interchangeable terms in New Testament times, and Paul preached his newfound faith to the Nabateans as he believed himself called to preach to non-Jews, and they were the nearest ones to hand. It was only 3 years after his conversion that Paul finally went up to Jerusalem to get to know Peter and the other apostles. Paul is emphasizing that he didn't speak to the apostles for 3 years because he didn't need to. He received his religious instruction direct from Jesus, and he didn't need to hear it from any of his earthly followers. If there were differences between what he was saying and what the apostles were saying, for example, whether Gentile converts should be circumcised or not, then so much the worse for the apostles. Undoubtedly, Paul had profound religious experiences, but the weight he placed on those experiences, I reckon, was partly out of defensiveness. He did not, as far as we know, ever meet Jesus during his lifetime. So his conservative Christian critics were able to quote sayings or mention incidents about Jesus that countered Paul's arguments. By contrast, Paul says little about Jesus' earthly career and only occasionally quotes words of his. So who was Paul, arguably the most important figure in Christianity after Jesus? He was a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city near the southeast corner of what we today call Turkey. We don't know the date of Paul's birth, but he was probably born around the same time as Jesus, and he died in Rome in either 62 or 64 AD. For roughly the first half of his life, Paul was a Pharisee. The word Pharisee, parashim in Hebrew, means separated. The Pharisees were devout Jewish laymen, numbering about 6,000 among a Jewish population of perhaps 500,000. They prepared themselves for the coming of God's kingdom by a wholehearted keeping of the Jewish law. They were mostly craftsmen and tradesmen, and were grouped into fellowships under the leadership of scribes. Unlike the Sadducees, they believed in angels and in a future resurrection of the body for all. According to Acts chapter 22, Paul studied in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, the leading Pharisee of his day. But Paul didn't learn his harshness towards Christians from Gamaliel. As we saw in Acts chapter 5, Gamaliel spoke up in favour of tolerance towards Christians. The harshness towards Christians, at least to those of Stephen's variety, came from the priestly aristocracy who ran the temple, and they were Sadducees. What was it about Jesus that caused Paul to side with the Sadducees when it came to dealing with Christians? Jesus had said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." I can think of only one thing about Jesus that would have enraged Paul: the claim that Jesus was the Messiah despite his dying on a cross. In his epistle to the Galatians, Paul quotes from the book of Deuteronomy, "Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree." It was blasphemous, Paul would have reasoned, to claim that God's Messiah, who was supposed to be a glorious, victorious figure, was a man cursed and rejected by God. God did not prevent Jesus from dying on the cross, so therefore God had rejected Jesus as he was a false Messiah. Now this brings us to Acts chapter 9, which recounts the story of the conversion of St. Paul. Paul, incidentally, is the Greek equivalent of Saul, which it was, of course, the name of the first king of Israel. We last heard of Paul at the end of Acts chapter 7, where he witnessed with approval the stoning of Stephen. At the beginning of chapter 9, we hear that Paul had sought authorization from the high priest to arrest any followers of Jesus he could find in Damascus. But this is dubious. The authority of the high priest did not extend to the Roman province of Syria, of which Damascus was part. The Roman governor would have had something to say if he'd heard the high priest was attempting to abduct people from Damascus. Moreover, Paul's own writings don't back up what it says in Acts. He never mentions Gamaliel, his supposed mentor, or Stephen, whose execution he's supposed to have witnessed, or that he had just come from Jerusalem at the time of his conversion. It could be that he was actually leaving Damascus at the time of his conversion rather than heading towards it. Paul says in his epistle to the Galatians that he was unknown by sight to the churches in Judea, which in fact is unlikely if he'd been actively persecuting Christians there. The biblical scholar Jerome Murphy O'Connor suggests that Paul was on the road to Damascus because he was on the way to visiting his parents in Tarsus, and that he joined a caravan for safety. As to Paul's confession to being a savage persecutor of the church, he may have been exaggerating somewhat. As he had no authority to arrest anyone, his persecution may simply consisted of encouraging synagogues to administer 39 lashes to the followers of Jesus, which was the severest punishment they were allowed to mete out to religious offenders, and one which Paul himself would suffer in the future. So, Paul was either heading to Damascus or heading away from it when a bright light came from the sky, shining all around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you fight against me?" Saul asked, "Lord, who are you?" And he received the reply, "I am Jesus, and you are fighting against me. Now I say, get up and go into the city. Someone there will tell you what you must do." The shock of the experience caused Paul to become temporarily blind, so those who were with him had to lead him into Damascus. Well, that's how Luke relates it. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that his conversion experience was also the final resurrection appearance of Jesus. Paul says, "Last of all, he appeared to me too. It was like a sudden, abnormal birth." Luke relates next that a disciple called Ananias was instructed in a dream to go to Paul's assistance. Ananias restores Paul's sight and then baptizes him. Immediately, Paul starts speaking about Jesus in the local synagogues, but the people there do not take kindly to this gamekeeper turned poacher. Because Paul's life is at risk, his friends put him in a basket and lower him down the side of the city wall. He then returns to Jerusalem, hoping to be accepted by the believers there. But they're suspicious of him until the kindly Barnabas befriends him and introduces him to the apostles. A fluent Greek speaker, Paul tries to convert Greek-speaking Jews in Jerusalem, and this arouses their hostility, and the apostles assist Paul to escape to Tarsus. Well, as I say, that's how Luke relates the story. But there is a serious problem with it. It contradicts Paul's own account of his early years as a Christian as he relates it in his epistles. As I said earlier, in writing to the Galatians, Paul relates that after his conversion, he went off to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Without consulting a single person, without going up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me, I went off to Arabia and afterwards returned to Damascus. 3 years later, I did go up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas, Peter that is. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul records his sufferings for the gospel and mentions in passing, "When I was in Damascus, the commissioner of King Aretas kept the city under observation to have me arrested, and I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall, and so escaped his clutches." So, according to Paul, he did not meet Peter until 3 years after his conversion, and spent some of that time in Arabia, probably in the Nabatean kingdom which bordered the Holy Land. Paul's activities in the Nabatean kingdom had enraged their king Aretas. We don't know what Paul got up to there because he doesn't tell us, which might indicate his time there was not a great success. So Paul returned to Damascus, but unfortunately for him, the Nabateans seized control of that city in 37 AD, taking advantage of a political upheaval at Rome. Paul, a failed missionary and a fugitive, had no option but to seek the help of the apostles in Jerusalem if he was to have a future in the Christian movement. Luke, in the interest of a simple, straightforward narrative, has omitted mention of Paul's time in Arabia and pretended that it was Jewish hostility that compelled Paul to escape from Damascus immediately after his conversion, whereas in fact it was the Nabateans Paul was fleeing from, and 3 years after his conversion, so a whole chunk has been cut out, edited out. So why did Paul go to the Nabateans without first consulting with the apostles? There was a problem that he might not be accepted because he was the persecutor of Christians, but there was a social aspect to it as well. Paul was a highly educated, cultivated man and a Roman citizen to boot, whereas the apostles were illiterate Galilean peasants. He towered above them intellectually. There's a touch of arrogance in his account of his dealings with them, recounted in the epistle to the Galatians. As for those reputed to be something, not that their importance matters to me, God does not recognize these personal distinctions. These men of repute, I say, imparted nothing further to me. Recognizing then the privilege bestowed on me, those who are reputed to be pillars of the community, James, Cephas and John, accepted Barnabas and myself as partners and shook hands on it. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he was clearly in the wrong. Paul believed he was called to evangelize the Gentiles, and the apostles were called to evangelize the Jews. It was believed that in the end times, God would restore Israel to greatness, and non-Jews would come to worship Israel's God. The book of Zechariah says, "In those days 10 men from the nations of every tongue shall take hold of the robe of a Jew, and they will say, 'Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you.'" Paul believed he was called to call non-Jews to repentance, and that Jesus would not return in glory until he had completed his mission. From a practical point of view, this special calling enabled him to carve out a role for himself independent of the apostles. That is why he went straight to evangelize the Nabateans on his conversion, for they were the largest group of non-Jews living near Damascus. Paul's great learning and intelligence and absolute conviction that he had a special calling and a special message from Christ made him a very difficult person to deal with. Peter is seen as the first pope by Roman Catholics, but he seems to have operated more like an Archbishop of Canterbury. He was held in respect and affection by most Christians, but there were those to the right and to the left of him who were not for compromising. To the left of him was Paul and his followers and the Samaritan Christians. Then to the right of him were the ultra-conservative Jewish Christians whom Paul called false brothers. They were as convinced of their rightness as Paul was of his. Peter tried to mediate between these different factions so that the Christian fellowship might not be broken, and he was denounced for his proposed compromises by extremists on both sides. A very difficult role to fulfill. What are we to make of Paul's claim to have a hotline to God? We may wonder why, if Jesus appeared to Paul, confiding to him a different version of the Christian message to the one being preached down in Jerusalem, why then didn't Jesus then appear to James, Peter and John to explain what he'd done? We might wish we had someone like Paul today, who could get definitive rulings from Jesus on the issues that divide us, such as birth control, the ordination of women, and same-sex marriage. We might ask our latter-day prophet to ask Jesus why God allowed COVID to happen. But this isn't how God works. Someone has said this: God doesn't so much answer our questions as question our answers. And that seems about right to me. Could it be that the conversion of Paul was an overwhelming religious experience, but that no words were conveyed to Paul in it? Paul's gospel, then, would be the working out of the implications of Jesus being the Son of God after all. If Jesus wasn't cursed by God on the cross, then he must have been there to bear a curse for others. If Jesus had taken away the curse separating others from God, then we don't make ourselves acceptable by meticulously following the Jewish law. Therefore, the requirement for Gentile converts to be circumcised was unnecessary. You can see the chain of thought. And what purpose did God have for Paul when he called him? Paul must have asked himself. With his education, languages, and Roman citizenship, he was ideally suited to reaching out to influential Gentiles. And as I said earlier, becoming apostle to the Gentiles enabled him to carve out a role for himself independent of Jerusalem's Christians. Paul could easily have arrived at all that without Jesus having to spell it out for him. Perhaps Paul did indeed hear voices. In 2 Corinthians he says that he was once caught up into paradise and heard words so secret that human lips may not repeat them. But Paul was not the last Christian to hear voices. There was Joan of Arc, for example. Did she really hear the voices of saints directing her life? Or was she perhaps schizophrenic? Perhaps that's a pointless question to ask about Joan or Paul. Jesus said, "By their fruits you shall know them." If the voices Joan and Paul heard led to positive actions, then perhaps inquiring about their psychological origin is beside the point. God worked through them, whatever the origin of their experiences. Fruits, not roots. Paul must have been an infuriating man to deal with. In the end, even the generous-hearted Barnabas had had enough of him. And yet, one cannot question Paul's devotion to the gospel. Overworked, always on the road, beaten, stoned and left for dead, shipwrecked, imprisoned, constantly in danger, often hungry, thirsty, and suffering from cold and exposure, and finally martyred. Above all, it was his vision of Christianity as a religion of grace, freed from the constraints of the Jewish law, which enabled our religion to spread throughout the world, while the original Jerusalem Christianity withered. For that, Paul does indeed deserve the title, the second founder of Christianity. Thank you for watching.